For most of her adult life, Eleanor believed she was doing everything right, because from the outside, her life looked stable and respectable. A long marriage, a familiar home, routines that rarely changed, and decisions that were praised as sensible. Yet somewhere beneath that structure, there was a quiet tension she could never fully explain. A feeling that followed her, even in moments that were supposed to feel fulfilling. And it wasn't until an ordinary afternoon, sitting alone in a quiet room, that the thought finally surfaced with unsettling clarity. The realization that many of the choices she had made were not truly hers, but carefully shaped responses to expectations she absorbed over decades. Expectations about who she should be, what she should tolerate, and what sacrifices were considered normal. And as this understanding slowly unfolded, she did not feel panic or anger, but something heavier and more disorienting. A deep awareness of how easily a life can be constructed around approval rather than truth, and how long it can take to notice the difference. Because she had not been forced into this life by a single dramatic moment, but guided into it gently, decision by decision, compromise by compromise, until the person she became felt familiar to everyone else, but strangely distant to herself. And as she sat with this thought, Eleanor sensed that this realization was not an ending yet, but the quiet beginning of a reckoning she could no longer postpone. As Eleanor allowed the realization to settle, memories began resurfacing in ways they never had before. Not as sharp regrets, but as soft reminders of moments when her instincts had whispered something different from the choices she ultimately made. Moments when she hesitated before agreeing, before staying silent, before prioritizing harmony over honesty. And she began to notice a pattern that had once felt invisible. How often she measured her decisions against how they would be received rather than how they felt. How quickly she learned to quiet discomfort by telling herself that this was simply how adulthood worked, that fulfillment was overrated, that stability was the real reward. And yet now, looking back with this new clarity, she understood that what she had called maturity was often just endurance dressed up as responsibility. And this understanding didn't arrive with blame toward anyone else, not her husband, not her family, not even the culture that shaped her expectations. Because the most unsettling part was realizing how willingly she had participated in becoming someone easier to accommodate, someone predictable, someone who rarely asked for more. And as she followed this thread of thought, Eleanor felt the growing awareness that acknowledging this truth did not mean she had wasted her life, but that continuing to ignore it would mean surrendering whatever years still remained. And for the first time, that possibility felt more frightening than the disruption honesty might bring. The following days unfolded quietly, yet inside Eleanor something fundamental had shifted. Because once awareness takes hold, it refuses to return to sleep. And she began noticing how even small interactions carried the weight of old habits. The automatic smiles, the careful phrasing, the instinct to soften her opinions before they fully formed. And each time she caught herself doing it, there was no panic or self-criticism, only a calm recognition, as if she were finally observing her life from a place of honesty rather than obligation. And this distance allowed her to see how much energy had been spent maintaining an image of steadiness, how often she confused peace with the absence of conflict. And as she reflected on the years behind her, she realized that her deepest exhaustion had never come from hardship itself, but from the constant effort of suppressing questions that deserved to be asked, desires that deserved to be spoken. And now, even without immediate answers or bold decisions, she felt an unfamiliar sense of relief. Because clarity did not demand action right away, it only asked for truth. And in granting herself that truth, Eleanor began to experience time differently, not as something slipping away, but as something still available, something she could choose to inhabit fully. And though uncertainty lay ahead, it no longer felt like a threat, but like an open space, uncomfortable perhaps, but finally honest. And in that honesty, she sensed the beginning of a life shaped less by endurance and more by intention. As Eleanor moved through the routines of her days, she became increasingly aware of how deeply her past choices had shaped not only her circumstances, but her internal landscape. Because memory was no longer something that surfaced as regret or longing, but as information, quiet and neutral, allowing her to see patterns without drowning in them. And this shift changed the way she related to herself, especially in moments of solitude, when the noise of expectation faded and she could finally hear her own thoughts without interruption. And in those moments, she recognized how often she had measured her worth by her usefulness to others, by her ability to remain composed, accommodating, and emotionally available, even when it cost her clarity. And acknowledging this did not bring anger or blame, only a deep, steady sadness for the parts of herself that had learned to shrink in order to belong. Yet alongside that sadness grew a gentle compassion because she understood now that survival had required adaptation, and adaptation had been mistaken for identity. And as this understanding settled in, she felt an unexpected strength emerge, not the kind that demands confrontation or dramatic change, but the kind that allows a person to sit with uncomfortable truths without rushing to escape them. And through this patience, she began to sense that healing was not about undoing the past or assigning fault, but about reclaiming authorship over the present, choosing moment by moment to respond rather than react, to listen inwardly before offering herself outwardly. And although the future remained undefined, Eleanor felt grounded in a way she never had before, because for the first time, her sense of direction came not from obligation or fear, but from an emerging alignment between who she was and who she was finally allowing herself to be. In the days that followed, Eleanor began to notice subtle but meaningful changes in how she experienced time, because moments no longer rushed past her in a blur of responsibility and reaction, but seemed to slow just enough for her to inhabit them fully. And this slowing revealed how often she had lived several steps ahead of herself, anticipating needs, smoothing outcomes, managing emotional weather that was never truly hers to control. And as she became aware of this pattern, she practiced something that once felt almost unnatural: pausing without justification, allowing silence without immediately filling it, letting conversations end without offering one last explanation or reassurance. And while this initially stirred discomfort, even guilt, she realized that the unease did not come from a wrongdoing, but from unfamiliar freedom, because she was no longer performing emotional labor out of habit. And this space, though quiet, felt expansive, giving her room to reflect on what she genuinely wanted rather than what she had learned to provide. And within this reflection, she confronted a long-held belief that love was something earned through endurance and self-sacrifice, a belief that had guided many of her decisions and quietly shaped her relationships. Yet now, as she examined it without judgment, she saw how incomplete it was, how it had taught her to confuse loyalty with silence and commitment with self-erasure. And this realization did not push her toward immediate action or dramatic resolution, but toward discernment, an emerging ability to recognize when connection felt mutual and when it required her to disappear. And with this discernment came a growing sense of trust in herself, because she no longer needed external validation to confirm her inner experience. And although uncertainty still existed, it no longer felt threatening, but honest, a reminder that she was living in alignment rather than avoidance. And as Eleanor settled into this new rhythm, she understood that transformation was not a single moment of clarity, but a series of quiet decisions, each one gently reinforcing her right to occupy her own life without apology. By the time Eleanor reached this point in her journey, she began to understand that change was not arriving as a sudden realization, but as a slow internal shift that revealed itself in ordinary moments, in the way she paused before answering questions she once rushed to satisfy, in the way she noticed tension in her body and no longer dismissed it as weakness. And as these small moments accumulated, she started to see how deeply she had been conditioned to prioritize harmony over honesty, often choosing silence not because she agreed, but because disagreement felt like a risk she had never been taught to take safely. And this realization stirred a quiet grief within her, not for any single event, but for the years spent interpreting endurance as maturity and self-denial as virtue. And yet, alongside that grief came a sense of compassion for the version of herself who had done the best she could with the awareness she had at the time. Because survival had required adaptation, and adaptation had slowly become habit. And as Eleanor sat with this understanding, she resisted the urge to judge her past choices, instead allowing them to exist as context rather than condemnation. And in doing so, she felt something loosen, as if the narrative she had carried for decades was finally being rewritten from the inside, not to erase pain, but to integrate it. And with this integration came clarity, a recognition that her discomfort had always been a form of communication, not an inconvenience, and that listening to it now was an act of respect rather than rebellion. And as she practiced responding differently, expressing uncertainty without apology, setting limits without explanation, choosing rest without justification, she noticed how the world did not collapse as she once feared, how relationships adjusted, some drifting, others deepening. And this evidence slowly rebuilt her trust in herself, not as someone who needed to be perfected, but as someone who deserved to be heard. And while the path ahead remained uncertain, it no longer felt threatening because she was no longer walking it disconnected from her own voice. And in that alignment, Eleanor felt a grounded sense of presence, a calm strength that did not seek validation, only truth. And that truth, steady and uncompromising, became the foundation upon which everything else could finally rest. As Eleanor continued forward, she became increasingly aware that growth was asking more of her than simple insight. It was demanding consistency, the quiet discipline of choosing herself again and again, even when no one was watching, even when old instincts urged her to retreat into familiar patterns of compliance and emotional invisibility. In this stage felt harder than any realization before it, because awareness had removed the comfort of denial, leaving her face to face with the responsibility of action. And there were moments when she felt tempted to soften her boundaries, to explain herself excessively, to make her truth more palatable so others would not feel unsettled by her change. Yet each time she did, a subtle heaviness returned, reminding her that peace built on self-betrayal was never sustainable. And slowly she began to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood, recognizing that clarity does not always invite agreement, and that not everyone is meant to accompany us through every version of ourselves. And this understanding brought with it a bittersweet clarity, as she observed certain relationships reveal their limitations not through conflict, but through silence, distance, or resistance to her autonomy. And while this realization carried loss, it also carried relief, because for the first time she was no longer negotiating her worth through sacrifice. And as Eleanor leaned into this new way of being, she noticed her internal world growing steadier, less reactive, more anchored in choice rather than fear. And she began to experience a deeper form of confidence, not the loud certainty of having answers, but the quiet assurance of trusting her own judgment, even when the outcome was unclear. And this trust transformed the way she approached each day, allowing her to move with intention rather than obligation, curiosity rather than dread. And as she reflected on the life unfolding ahead of her, she understood that fulfillment was not something to be earned through endurance or perfection, but something cultivated through presence, honesty,
and the courage to remain aligned with herself. And in this alignment, Eleanor felt a profound sense of integrity, a feeling that her inner and outer worlds were finally beginning to speak the same language, and that harmony, once sought through silence, was now being created through truth.
In the quiet culmination of this inner journey, Eleanor realized that nothing external had dramatically changed. There was no public reckoning, no moment that demanded witnesses or applause. Yet internally, everything had settled into a clarity she had never known before, because she was no longer waiting for permission to feel complete. And this realization arrived gently, almost imperceptibly, as she moved through an ordinary day and noticed how differently she inhabited it, how her breath felt steadier, how her thoughts no longer raced to anticipate others' needs before acknowledging her own. And it became clear to her that freedom was not the absence of responsibility or connection, but the absence of self-erasure. And as she reflected on the years she had spent equating love with endurance and loyalty with silence, she did not feel bitterness, only understanding, because she could finally see that those choices had been made with the tools she had at the time. And forgiving herself for that became the final essential act of healing. And with that forgiveness came a profound calm, the kind that does not rely on certainty or external validation, but on an unshakable trust in one's own inner compass. And Eleanor understood that her life ahead would still contain complexity, loss, and unanswered questions, but those uncertainties no longer felt threatening because she was no longer abandoning herself to survive them. And as she stood in this awareness, she felt deeply grounded in the present, no longer haunted by who she had been or anxious about who she needed to become, but fully rooted in who she was now, a woman capable of honesty without cruelty, strength without hardness, and connection without self-sacrifice. And in this groundedness, she discovered that peace was not a destination reached after everything was resolved, but a way of moving through life with integrity, attentiveness, and self-respect. And as Eleanor stepped forward into the next chapter, she did so quietly, confidently, and without urgency, knowing that for the first time, she was not living from habit or fear, but from alignment. And that alignment, steady, self-trusting, and deeply human, was the truest form of freedom she had ever known.